patrons from distant lands, listeners of old, it is time once again to travel down the Hobbit hole. Today I'm just going to run through some pretty high-level descriptions of some ideas and concepts that came up while I was researching and scripting my video on the Druedain, so I'm presenting less of a single developed argument and more a collection of topics that weren't quite relevant enough to that video, which was really focused on describing the Druedain themselves. Things that I'm certainly interested in fleshing out more fully, but at this moment I'm not quite sure where exactly they will lead. But still, I think, of interest, especially with regard to the Druedain, even though a lot of them kind of lead into other topics. So the first little scenic detour that I took while I was doing my research was prehistoric human migration, the ways that idea has been understood over the past couple of centuries, and the way it's been viewed by different disciplines. Specifically, the idea of Proto-Indo-European, which I think is a concept that Tolkien would have had to be at least somewhat familiar with, and the possibility of maybe identifying some specific ways that that concept, or I guess maybe you could call it theory, influenced his mythology. I mentioned very briefly at the end of the Druedain video that people are accustomed to and very comfortable with drawing parallels between myths and legends and folklore and elements of Tolkien's work. Another connection that's quite often identified is elements from Christian or specifically Catholic theology or tradition that influenced the development of certain ideas and plot points and characterizations. And of course, when done with care and attention, those are both absolutely crucial topics and themes to explore. But one thing that I think frequently gets overlooked was Tolkien's interest in what we would call, I guess, the harder disciplines. Linguistics, for one, definitely, but also history, archaeology, anthropology, astronomy. Somewhat infamously, one of the issues that he gets really hung up on after the publication of Lord of the Rings is, I've developed this idea that the history of Arda is meant to be an alternate or hypothetical historical time period of real Earth. One of the things he's at pains to clarify to people is that Middle-earth is meant to be our Earth. It's not another world. It's this one right here. And what he's written is, from a certain perspective, a mythologized or legendary account of a hypothetical prehistoric time period. As his life progressed, he moved more and more away from the comparatively rather flamboyant world that he presents in the Book of Lost Tales, where his premise is that these stories have been filtered through several layers of misunderstanding and cultural evolution, so something that's firmly in the genre of legend or myth or fairy story, and really more towards something that was both stylistically and conceptually, I think, closer to memoir and history. There's a quote, I think it's from On Fairy Stories, where I don't have it in front of me, so this is a paraphrase, but Tolkien claims that he's always been more drawn to, quote, history, true or feigned. And so in returning to the Silmarillion, he's trying to filter the matter of myth through this pseudo-historical framework that really developed while he was writing Lord of the Rings, I think you could argue. He's faced with such problems as his original conception of Arda, which was as a sort of flat, Discworld-esque realm that was at first lit only by the stars, and then later by lamps, and then by trees, and then out of that the sun and the moon emerge, which is a story that works really well mythically. But I think Tolkien's concern could be potentially immersion-breaking for a reader who's approaching Middle-earth more seriously. Someone who's expecting not just moral or emotional verisimilitude, but actual accordance with the unavoidable facts of astronomy, for instance, as understood in the 20th century. So that idea in itself, I think, is gonna be one of the overarching themes of my excursions in Tolkien studies for the next few months. But one of the specific places where I think that concept crops up of the tension between the mythic and the historical and sort of the overlap between those two, which is, I think, the space that Tolkien's trying really hard to inhabit, is this motif of the Great Westward Migration. This is something I've definitely noted before as sort of an interesting little oddity that I felt like was probably going to mean something eventually, but I wasn't quite sure what to do with it yet. Tolkien really likes this idea of a people or a species originating in the Far East, in what he sometimes suggests is the central regions of Arda, and then journeying from this lost sort of mythic homeland from east to west, in the process breaking into 3 sets or peoples. But these distinct peoples can still affirm that they are kin to each other, usually by identifying some shared features of their language. So for the Eldar, they awaken in Cuiviénen. The Eldar are the ones who undertake the great journey to Valinor, and they are chunked into the Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri. With men, we have the House of Hador, the House of Beor, and the House of Haleth. And then even for hobbits, when he's describing how they ended up where they did, the story he comes up with is the earliest records and memories that we have show them starting on the banks of the Anduin. They migrate west, end up roughly in the Shire, and they come in 3 flavors, the Fallowhides, the Harfoots, and the Stoors. And what's more, in this 3-flavor model, it's all the same 3 flavors. So the details will vary, but whether we're talking elf or man or hobbit, there's the clan that's tall and fair. In the case of elves and hobbits, this is the smallest group, the more noble group. So in elves, these are the Vanyar. For men, this is the House of Marach, or later the House of Hador. And then for hobbits, it's the Fallowhides. Again, the specifics and the details will vary. It's not like they're carbon copies of each other, but very clearly they're all kind of occupying similar cultural slots. Then there's flavor number 2, which for elves would be roughly the Noldor. For men, it's the House of Beor, and for hobbits, it's the Harfoots. Less tall, more powerfully built, tending to be darker hair, sometimes darker eyes, darker complexions. More pragmatic, more scientifically oriented than artistically, to speak in like the broadest possible terms. Often ends up somehow compared to or affiliated with dwarvishness. For example, Harfoots are the only ones of the hobbits that tend to grow beards. And of course, Matan and his kin are of a family or little subgroup of the Noldor that is likewise known for being able to grow beards much earlier than I guess elves are usually supposed to be able to. And then the third group tends to be sort of the base form. They tend to be less closely related, at least linguistically speaking, to the other 2. So this is the case for the Teleri, the Haladin, or the people of Haleth, and the Stoors, who speak Stoorish, I guess. This group tends to be physically smaller, and it tends to kind of display the traits that would be most characteristic of the respective species. So this is very definitely a pattern in Middle-earth, and a pretty specific one, corresponding even in details like facial hair and degree of linguistic separation from other groups. And I find it pretty difficult to fathom that Tolkien wouldn't have been aware that he was repeating this. I think it definitely suggests something intentional. And that got me thinking, is there something he's specifically trying to represent with this motif? So that got me thinking in terms of actual prehistorical migrations, combined specifically with philology as the way that these characters default to describe this migration. I started to consider the hypothetical language trees that show the spread of Proto-Indo-European, a topic I've been aware of for a long time, but haven't ever really done any formal investigation into. And really, I still haven't. I've just started to sort of poke around more than I previously had. But even just in that initial poking around phase, I found some stuff I was really kind of surprised and intrigued by. So what am I talking about, or what do I think I'm talking about when I say Proto-Indo-European, or PIE, as some call it? My understanding of the basic premise is that there's a sort of core vocabulary of very old, important, commonly used words that are very, very similar between a ton of languages, and ones that are not only geographically very distant from each other, but also don't appear to be very closely related. So obviously the Romance languages all share a bunch of different features to the point where some of them could be argued to be nearly mutually intelligible. And that's because they're all either descended from or heavily influenced by Latin. maybe less obvious similarities between, for instance, Latin and Old Germanic words and grammatical forms and things. And then, oh look, those same features also appear in Scandinavian languages and Celtic languages and Persian and Sanskrit and Central European language families. And these similarities had been observed and pondered for centuries. But around the 19th century, there became this really systematic approach to tracing the different shifts and changes back through time. And this led to the conclusion that, at least linguistically speaking, a tremendous proportion of the modern languages of not just Europe, but really Eurasia, were descended from the same ancient language that became known as Proto-Indo-European. Which really is kind of a mind-blowing conclusion when you think about it, because it basically supposes that there was a common linguistic ancestor that gave rise to the languages spoken by a very large and very disparate subset of Earth's total population. The other really intriguing thing about it is, to borrow another quote and paraphrase it, a language requires a people to speak it. If a language is spreading, then that means that people who speak that language are moving. If one language divides into two separate ones, then that means that a group of people who all spoke the same language somehow stopped talking to each other for long enough, and for whatever reason, that their speeches could become sundered. So obviously this hypothesis had tremendous implications for the understanding of prehistoric Europe. And one of the things that I was surprised to find is that the most widely accepted version or hypothesis of that history, not universally accepted, but still considered to be the most reasonable one by the largest number of scholars today, is a variant of something called the Kurgan hypothesis, which was first formulated right around the turn of the 20th century, based to a large degree on those philological and linguistic studies. And later methods like DNA analysis, for instance, have turned up some evidence to support it. And the Kurgan hypothesis basically suggests that Proto-Indo-European, that language that was the common ancestor for so many different languages, was spoken by this hypothetical group, let's call them the Proto-Indo-Europeans, who inhabited the steppeland north of the Black Sea, right around the period where the Stone Age was kind of giving way to the Bronze Age. And then that language and its daughter languages spread out from that point. And if you bring up a map of the world and look at the Black Sea, especially if you imagine that maybe there's been some, cataclysmic flooding and continent shifting and maybe the loss of a few significant land masses off the west coast, that area is kind of right smack in the middle of Eurasia, or another way to say it might be in the middle regions of Arda. So at this point, all I can say is I am convinced that Tolkien's account of how different waves of people moved from east to west, scattering linguistic fragments in their wake, was somehow influenced by this model. And I suspect there may be other connections as well, like maybe the three-flavor model is gonna match up somehow with historical descriptions of the speakers of a triad of daughter languages or something. There's a lot of material to sort of sift through and evaluate there. But especially in light of the ways that Middle-earth, particularly the earliest histories in the Silmarillion, can be read as a sort of interpretation of prehistoric Neolithic Europe, combined with this sort of applied linguistics angle, definitely is something I think is going to be neat. Very much related to that, and something that's been occurring to me or nagging at me for a while, is the mutual influence that Tolkien and C.S. Lewis exerted on each other. And I think this is another case where there are some very obvious connections that have been examined so often that they've really become the low-hanging fruit. C.S. Lewis and Tolkien knew each other for a time. They were close friends and colleagues. They had a lot of shared interests. They were both successful authors who redefined in many ways what would become the modern fantasy genre. Both of them set stories in a detailed alternate world that was filled with characters and figures drawn from historical myth and legend, but the stories are also very rooted in a particular flavor of Christian morality and ethics. And those are all true and valid and important things to recognize, obviously. But precisely because they're so clearly important, first of all, they've been referred to and referenced so often, and in some cases so casually or carelessly even, that they've become cliched, overemphasized maybe even to the point of becoming misleading and being given more weight than maybe they merit. And the other problem I see is that because they've been given this disproportionate emphasis and become cliched, I think they tend to obscure the other rather weirder ways in which similar concepts and philosophies and influences turn up in their work, but in each case having been filtered through, on the one hand, Tolkien's imagination, and on the other hand, Lewis's. And Chris Tolkien has this great line in Lay of Lathian where he says, some of these notes serve to demonstrate basically how different C.S. Lewis's aesthetic was from Tolkien's. And some of this, too, I think, comes down to the tendency to regard fantasy and science fiction as being distinct. And here I am now with my own cliche that I'm spouting. I'm far from the first person to take note of the fact that a lot of times the line between fantasy and science fiction is very arbitrary. It's sort of an artificial distinction. And for a while, I don't know if this is still a thing, but for a while there was a sort of movement to talk about SF instead, speculative fiction, which would encompass fantasy and sci-fi and all of the weird little bits in between, like is it a soft sci-fi story? Is it a historical fantasy, a futuristic fantasy? Like, at what point does fantasy become horror? What even is magical realism? Like, we could really easily resolve all of these problems if we just started viewing them all as outgrowths of the same basic impulse. But regardless, I think that sort of reflexive impulse to classify sci-fi versus fantasy and put them on different shelves is a factor in why, when we think about C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien as fantasists, the default is to compare Lord of the Rings to Narnia. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think we also need to compare Numenor to the Space Trilogy, because the whole point of the Space Trilogy, most particularly the first book, Out of the Silent Planet, was that it was meant to be a sort of writing challenge between Lewis and Tolkien. The idea was that they both enjoyed reading basically what we would now call works of early science fiction. I think there's either a letter or an interview where I think Tolkien calls them scientific fiction or scientific novels, maybe. Lewis and Tolkien both enjoyed that genre, but they had issues both with, I think, the quality of the writing and with the philosophies that were being expressed. So they agreed that they would each try to write, essentially, a sci-fi book. Lewis was supposed to write a space travel story, and Tolkien was supposed to write a time travel story. And as one would expect, of course, C.S. Lewis promptly finished his and then went on to write 2 additional stories in the series before moving on to a new project. Tolkien found this rather irritating. He started to write his time travel novel, which was going to be called The Lost Road, that was eventually going to have one of its main arcs set on Numenor during the downfall. The Narnia books and Lord of the Rings both came out much later, and at a time when both of them had kind of gone in different directions, creatively and intellectually. And of course, Lord of the Rings ended up coming out looking like much more of a heroic romance than like a so-called scientific novel. But it's interesting to consider what would have happened if Tolkien had actually succeeded in expressing those themes and events from his cycle of legends, which of course was already very much in existence, if not in necessarily always the form that we would recognize it, through the same kind of scientific lens that Lewis succeeded in expressing similar ideas in the Space Trilogy. That impulse was very much there, and in fact Tolkien attempted to act on it. And because he never really progressed very far with the Lost Road, it's of course hard to imagine fully what that would look like, but I think we can get maybe an idea by looking at Lewis's half of that sort of collaborative challenge. And yes, this is another example of something that I have not put in the time and study and thought necessary to come to a really firm conclusion, but my hunch is that there are going to be far more connections and parallels between the Space Trilogy and, say, Tolkien's Middle-earth writings between the Book of Lost Tales period and the beginning of the composition of Lord of the Rings than there is in comparing the Lord of the Rings to Narnia. And finally, to pretty much change tack altogether, we need to spend some more time on the Druedain and the Orcs. Now, I mentioned in the video that the Druedain and the Orcs have a particular hatred for each other, just a really special intensity of loathing, and also that the Orcs are especially afraid of and wary of the Druedain and their scary magical stone carvings. There's a couple of additional things there that I kind of want to pull out. So here's a couple of quotes from the section in Unfinished Tales called The Druedain. Their voices were deep and guttural. They could be relentless enemies, and when once aroused, their red wrath was slow to cool, though it showed no sign save the light in their eyes, for they fought in silence and did not exult in victory, not even over orcs, the only creatures for whom their hatred was implacable. They were not long-lived and were ever few in number, and their losses were heavy in their feud with the orcs, who returned their hatred and delighted to capture them and torture them. They had a marvelous skill as trackers of all living creatures, ... For the Druedain used their scent like hounds, save that they were also keen-eyed. They boasted that they could smell an orc to windward further away than other men could see them, and could follow its scent for weeks except through running water. And then in the notes, note 5, to the unfriendly who, not knowing them well, declared that Morgoth must have bred the orcs from such a stock, the Eldar answered, doubtless Morgoth, since he can make no living thing, bred orcs from various kinds of men, but the Druedain must have escaped his shadow, for their laughter and the laughter of orcs are as different as is the light of Aman from the darkness of Angband. But some thought, nonetheless, that there had been a remote kinship which accounted for their special enmity. Orcs and Droogs each regarded the other as renegades. And then finally, note 9, they had a law against the use of all poisons for the hurt of any living creatures, even those who had done them an injury, save only orcs, whose poisoned darts they countered with others more deadly. So this offers us, potentially, yet another way to resolve the ever-recurring issue of what the heck even are orcs, and where did Morgoth get them? One of the purely logistical binds that Tolkien found himself in was the impulse to move away from an elven origin for orcs and start exploring men as a potential, foundation stock. But if men are supposed to have appeared well after the elves have already come up and done their thing, then how do we account for the orcs that, for example, get unleashed on Beleriand after Morgoth destroys the trees? The timing there is not going to work out. But if we go off the theory that the Druedain are meant to represent one of those terminated branches of the hominid family, something like a Neanderthal, not quite the same species exactly as Homo sapiens, but maybe branching off from a common ancestor. To me, that sounds like it potentially could resolve that timeline problem. Now, admittedly, to introduce evolutionary biology into pre-solar Arda is going to require a great deal of mental flexibility. And you'd really have to think through the definition of capital M men. Where would the line be drawn between man and beast? What, if any, is the difference between intelligence and sentience? All that stuff that Tolkien was wrestling with and we continue to wrestle with and probably really doesn't have a good answer. But at least for me personally, one of my headcanons from now on is definitely going to include the possibility that Druedain and orcs represent one branch of descent from Homo erectus midangardiae. And then there was another line that resulted in capital M men. It just seems to fit very neatly. And it also has, I think, really great dramatic potential. That idea that orcs and Druedain hate each other so desperately precisely because they recognize their kinship. And the Druedain view orcs not so much as victims, but as rogues, and then the orcs in turn viewing the Druedain as traitors. It just seems much more chewy and satisfying than the elf-orc dichotomy, where the orcs are sort of, I guess, jealous of the elves, resentful of them, and also have been, deluded into believing that they're wicked and cruel and are going to eat them. And elves, meanwhile, being able to look upon orcs with horror and pity, but also with, a bit of smugness, perhaps. Maybe the reason elves are always gathering up pearls is so that they have something to clutch, that kind of thing. Also, for me personally, in other fantasy settings that have, quote, orcs, something like Dungeons and Dragons or World of Warcraft, or honestly, almost any other high fantasy setting, where orcs might well be hostile, but they're not quite the physical manifestation of the will of the sole uncontested god of evil. And so you have a lot more leeway to entertain the idea of orcs that are good or neutral or even just, not always chaotic evil. I quite enjoy the orcish aesthetic. So it very much tickles my fancy to think of the Druedain as the possible non-evil counterpart to orcs. And the corollary to that is, even if you just sort of assume that as a possibility, you then start to consider what traits of the orcs are due to their corruption versus which ones might be innate. For example, like the sense of smell. It comes across as very creepy and animalistic when the orcs are tracking people by scent, but the Druedain do the same thing, and that ability is actually what makes them so valued as trackers. Other similarities would be like the rough, guttural voices. In orcs, this is partly due to their kind of gnarly language and also just partly due to their bad attitudes, I guess. The Druedain seem to have a similarly gnarly language, but even though the sound of them talking may sound rough and strange and even a little unpleasant, it's not so much a sign of them being evil. It's portrayed as more a matter of custom and taste. Short lifespans is another similarity. I think somewhere Tolkien describes how his conception of orcs is that they are not especially long-lived, and the Druedain likewise seem to cap out at around 45. In both cases, they have this great physical power of endurance and resistance to injury or ability to ignore pain. And that makes sense for orcs because, in theory, they've been designed and optimized for war. But again, maybe that was a pre-existing trait because it's not like orcs are the only ones noted for that. And finally, there's the watchstones, which the orcs seem to understand almost instinctively, and also the way they function reminds me a lot of the stone watchers outside of Cirith Ungol that Sam has to get by in order to retrieve Frodo. First, because they give off that sense of vigilance or being watched or observed that's so powerful that it can be felt and sensed by others, to the point where it's difficult even just to muster the will to walk by them. And secondly, the fact that they can apparently send some sort of signal or communication when you do walk by them. So it's like that technique or technology has been adapted to evil purposes. And I think it's kind of all the more striking because both of these things, the watchstones of the Druedain and the stone watchers outside of Cirith Ungol, are kind of oddities. They don't really have many other parallels, at least that I can think of. I can't really call to mind anything comparable in the dwarven world. Elves would rely on the natural world to bring them news of who or what is passing their borders. And then men, as usual, just have to rely on mundane things like horn calls and beacons and actual physical guards people. Poor humans were always kind of getting the short end of the magic stick. So this theory basically would have pretty good legs as far as I can tell, and it's a shame that, of course, the only direct allusion Tolkien makes to it is in kind of a one-off footnote. And I'm not really aware of any other allusions to the potential kinship between Druedain and Orcs, at least not in the stuff that's been published. But it does seem to be a very promising candidate of all of the various competing contradictory theories and histories and explanations and such. So those are my thoughts. I always look forward to seeing how people respond or what additional knowledge they have to contribute, because especially in this case, it's like these are topics that I don't have expertise in. So I'm kind of unapologetically crowdsourcing some of my research here. I was really kind of tickled by how many connections existed in the very slim amount of Druedain lore that we have access to. I'd always thought of them as sort of an isolated part of Middle-earth, both conceptually and, literally isolated because they try not to have contact with anybody. But in spite of that, I think they really are surprisingly well integrated with many of the themes and little historical arcs within Middle-earth, particularly the later evolutions of it. If you've stuck with me this far, thank you so much for listening. Let me know your thoughts, and I will talk to you all soon.